Welcome to Kaleidoscope. Let's talk. In our first program for 2024 on Let's Talk this week, it's all about cricket, and cricket seen through the lens of a British writer. Nicholas Brookes will be at the Galle Literary Festival this month. He will be chatting about his book, An Island's 11, The Story of Sri Lankan Cricket, which has been called the Cricket Book of the Year. Nicholas is obviously a die-hard cricket fan, like all of us, and cricket is more than just a sport for him. Tim Wigmore, in fact, called Nicholas's book an essential addition to cricket literature. Safe to say, Nicholas's book hit a sixer. Today, we catch up with Nicholas Brookes from his home in South London for more insights on this gentleman's game and, of course, his book. Welcome, Nicholas. Good to have you on the show, and we are going to be very thrilled to have you at the Galle Literary Festival. What led you to write An Island's 11?
The first thing that made me write An Island's 11 was figuring out or realizing that there was a real dearth of books about Sri Lankan cricket. I was a huge fan of Sri Lanka growing up in the 90s when the team was on top of the world, and it seemed to me as a kid as though they'd always been kind of a part of cricket's furniture. And it was only when I grew into adulthood that I realized that they only got test status in the early 80s, and that before that, there was kind of a long history which had really been forgotten, underexplored. And actually, I mean, going to the library at Lord's was amazing. I mean, they've got a treasure trove of books about cricket, and every other test playing nation had columns and columns. And then I got to the Sri Lanka section, and it was absolutely tiny. You know, it was sort of 6 or 7 books, some of them very old, some of them, out of print or kind of not that well written, not up to date. And so I realized that there was a gap and that Sri Lankan history needed to be sort of better explored. And then when I started digging into it, I just grew increasingly fascinated. I realized that a lot of stories had already been lost just through no one recording them, and that if I left this book maybe 10 or 20 years, more would kind of fall into the ether and disappear. So it was something that I wanted to do straight away, to kind of capture everything that I could.
You've said that Sri Lankan cricket has an identity. Why is that, and what is it?
Sri Lanka is probably one of the smaller nations of the whole cricket playing world, right? It's a small island of 20 people, yet it's been responsible for so many inventions in cricket, so many revolutionary players. I'm thinking of people from your Malingas, your Ajantha Mendises, your Dilshans, your Jayasuriyas, even Arjuna and Aravinda were really kind of revolutionary in their day. And so I think that feeds into Sri Lanka's cricket identity. I mean, I think it's about ingenuity, improvisation, and I think there's kind of a sort of I always felt during my time living in Sri Lanka that there was kind of a madcap tropical hedonism about the island, something that where the culture is influenced by the environment. And I think that's seeped into the cricket as well. And you see a real spirit in the way Sri Lanka play cricket. It's always exciting, it's always dynamic, and it's always kind of full of fun.
What challenges did you face when you were writing this book?
My original plan was just to take short trips to Sri Lanka, do interviews, and then come back home and write it here, which I quickly realized was going to be impossible, because I think to write a book like this, you really have to kind of immerse yourself in the culture of a place. And for me, trying to understand, trying to insinuate myself into Sri Lankan culture and Sri Lankan life was really important. And so I figured out a way to do that, which was by teaching at St. Thomas's in Mount Lavinia, which was a fantastic experience. They agreed to kind of give me a flat on campus and give me my meals in exchange for teaching English, which was just an amazing experience because the school has such a rich cricketing heritage. It's a wonderful place, and it really gave me a sense of kind of the workings of Sri Lankan institutions. And so that was kind of something which began as a challenge and quickly grew into a solution, which was fantastic. But I mean, there were others. Access was, something that was really difficult for me, as a fairly unknown writer, trying to approach cricketers, administrators, constantly convincing them that this was a real thing, that it was a valid project, that it was worth them taking up their time to contribute to. And I was incredibly lucky that I received so much kindness from Sri Lankan players and Sri Lankan former players, journalists, people who are in the know about cricket. I owe a great debt to so many who were hugely helpful. Uh, and then I think the third major challenge that I faced was, it's a huge project when you're looking at 170 years of cricket history and you're trying to condense that into a sort of, a readable book while keeping hold of a narrative thread. So, it was my first book. It was a learning process, but it was absolutely fascinating, and I loved every minute of it.
So, what are some of the gems in your book that you'd like to share with us?
As I said earlier, I think that the early history of Sri Lankan cricket, everything right up to 1982, really, has been pretty underexplored. And so something which I wasn't as excited about was digging into those early days. But it ended up being a period which really captivated me. And, I mean, just full of fascinating stories. I mean, going right back to the whistle stops, how the early teams traveling to the Ashes from England or Australia would stop in Colombo and play a one-day game. And so, going right back to the 1880s, you have these teams of Ceylon players playing against some of the greats, from cricketing history, guys like W.G. Grace, Don Bradman, Jack Hobbs, Keith Miller, all these kind of really marquee names who in many cases didn't play in lots of countries, but all of them stopped over in Colombo and had a game there. That was something which really captivated me. Going through to the stories of some of the early greats who I think you'll hear a certain generation of Sri Lankan men talking about, but no one else. I'm thinking of guys like Sathasivam and Desaram, two in particular who had amazing stories. I mean, Sathasivam was a very cavalier kind of gentleman cricketer who really electrified the Colombo scene. Everyone who saw him bat was totally entranced by him. And, he was touted by many great international cricketers as being the best they ever saw, but he really lacked the opportunity. He only got to play 11 first-class matches. So he was a fascinating figure, especially because there was this kind of darker coda where he was accused of killing his wife late in his career, wrongly, as far as I can tell. And I managed to do some digging into that investigation. So that was very interesting, as was the story of Derek Desaram, who went to play cricket in England at university and did fantastically. He could have played cricket for the MCC in England, but chose to stay in Sri Lanka. And he was a very engaging, enigmatic figure too. And then, I mean, going through to, the 50s, 60s, 70s, where the team was really working hard to try and receive international recognition. They were taking on all comers, realizing that every game meant something, going on kind of amazing tours as well, sacrificing their own work lives, their own career advancement, their own financial security in order to try and put Sri Lankan cricket on the map. Some amazing stories there, and lots of wonderful characters who I got to meet and absolutely loved, especially hearing about their first trip to England for the 1975 World Cup.
How does one contend with Sri Lankan history through the lens of cricket?
That I wanted the book to kind of I wanted its scope to be broader than cricket and to touch on Sri Lanka as a place and kind of express how cricket came to mean so much to Sri Lanka. And I found out so many fascinating things. I think the first really unique aspect of Sri Lanka, which you see on the cricket field, is this kind of patchwork identity, right? It's always been an island which has been a kind of melting pot going right back to the early days where you have Sinhalese, Tamils, and Moors, and then you have three colonial orders, the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the British, kind of adding more and more layers into this kind of patchwork island. And I saw that, in the way that the early cricket was played. At first, it was played by planters up country, and then you had Malay soldiers in Colombo taking to the game early in the 1800s, Dutch burghers, and then around the turn of 1900, you start to see clubs popping up across Colombo: the Sinhalese Sports Club, the Tamil Union, the Moors Cricket Club. So cricket gave me a fantastic insight into some of that early history. It was, amazing to see the way that Colombo developed through cricket. And, you know, as time went on, you can certainly see some of the politics of the country playing out in the cricketing arena as well. Yeah, I felt that Sri Lankan cricket was a really good lens through which to explore the island, to understand the culture a little bit more. And yeah, as I said, I think it's fascinating that Sri Lankan cricket has such a pan-national appeal right now. I think everywhere you go, every village, every town, you'll find people playing cricket.
What is it about Sri Lankan cricket that drew you in?
I loved Sri Lanka as a team from when I was a kid. You know, in the late 90s, the early 2000s, there were so many just incredible figures in Sri Lankan cricket from, you know, Arjuna Ranatunga, Aravinda de Silva, Sanath Jayasuriya, Murali. These guys, you know, and then you had Sangakkara, Jayawardena, Dilshan, all these incredible cricketers coming through. And as a kid, there was something sort of I want to say almost mythical, almost larger than life about the Sri Lankan team. You know, these guys with these hugely long names that I couldn't pronounce, but who seemed to play cricket in a different way. They had such a cavalier style. And so, you know, growing up, I always loved watching them. And yeah, they always seemed to me to be kind of like the coolest team in cricket. So I've had that passion for a long time. But I think also there was something about South Asia's passion for the game, which doesn't really exist in England. You know, you do find some people who are cricket aficionados and who love it. But I think that kind of all encompassing uh, obsession with cricket is something which you really only find in South Asia. I absolutely think that now it's the home of cricket, it's the heartland of cricket, and it's where cricket is going to be moving forward. And I love that coming to Sri Lanka the first time, that there's this kind of all pervasive sense, right? You get into a tuk-tuk and the driver wants to talk to you about cricket. You go to a village in the evening and there are kids, and not just kids, kids and aunties and everyone playing cricket on the street. So I mean, that certainly drew me. I think there was also, you know, people talk about Sri Lankan hospitality, and I don't think it's a lazy cultural stereotype. You know, when you try and interview cricketers in England, it can seem very closed off. It can seem very difficult. It can seem like you're asking a lot of them to try and sit down for half an hour and ask questions. Whereas in Sri Lanka, I found it was the opposite. Everyone had a story to tell, and more often than not, they wanted to tell it and were able to tell it in a dynamic style. You know, so many times I'd call up someone I didn't know and ask them if it was okay to do an interview, and they'd say, yes, come home, have a cup of tea, I'll tell you all my stories, and then who else can I put you in touch with? And so that was, you know, really lovely. As a journalist, writer, incredibly helpful.
Who, in your opinion, are the cricketing greats of all time?
I feel obliged to touch on some of the guys who are often overlooked, those great cricketers from the pre-test era who, you know, paved the way and sacrificed so much. So guys like Sathasivam and Desaram, who we've touched on, but then, you know, Michael Tissera, Gamini Gunasena, Ivers Gunasekara, Anura Tenakun, all great players. And then, you know, I was a huge fan of Duleep Mendis and Roy Dias in the 80s. Moving on to, you know, Arjuna, Aravinda, Murali, Vas, Sangha, and Mahela. I really can't pick between them. There are so many fantastic Sri Lankan cricketers. And, you know, for such a small island to keep consistently churning out such rare talents, I think is, you know, it's an anomaly. And I think it speaks volumes, and it's a real testament to Sri Lanka's love for cricket and the kind of natural talent which exists right across the island.
Kaleidoscope is on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And if you like our show, don't forget to subscribe and follow for weekly updates.